President-elect Joe Biden described the 2020 election as a battle for the soul of this nation. With the impact of the coronavirus crisis, our country's financial situation, racial inequities, and other recent events, we're at a critical juncture in our nation's history. So I'm absolutely delighted to have the renowned columnist George Will join me this evening to discuss the election results and what it means to our country and the world, as well as the transition and what he sees as the way forward. George Will's newspaper column has been syndicated by the Washington Post since 1974. Today, it appears twice weekly in newspapers across 47 states and 4 countries. In 1976, he became a regular contributing editor of Newsweek magazine, for which he provided a bi-monthly essay until 2011. In 1977, he won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary in his newspaper columns, and the Wall Street Journal has called him perhaps the most powerful journalist in America. In June 2019, Mr. Will released his most recent work, The Conservative Sensibility, and we'll be sharing a link to that book in our follow-up communications after this event. And altogether, 8 collections of Mr. Will's Newsweek and Washington Post columns have been published, the most recent being One Man's America, The Pleasures and Provocations of Our Singular Nation in 2008. Mr. Will has also published 3 books on political theory, Statecraft as Soulcraft, What the Government Does, The New Season, A Spectator's Guide to the 1988 Election, and Restoration, Congress Term Limits and the Recovery of Deliberative Democracy. Among his many interests that some of you might not know is a passion for baseball. In 1990, Mr. Will published Men at Work, The Craft of Baseball, which he mentioned might just be the most successful and popular work on baseball that's been published. And in fact, it topped the New York Times bestseller list for 2 months. In 1998, Scribner published Bunts, Curt Flood, Camden Yards, Pete Rose, and Other Reflections on Baseball, which is a best-selling collection of new and previously published writings by Mr. Will on baseball. His most recent book on baseball is A Nice Little Place on the North Side, Wrigley Field at 100. And in July 2000, Mr. Will was a member of Major League Baseball's Blue Ribbon Panel, which examined baseball economics. He's taught political philosophy at Michigan State University, University of Toronto, and Harvard. He served as staff member in the United States Senate from 1970 to 1972. From 1973 through 1976, he was the Washington editor of National Review magazine. And in 1981, he became a founding panel member on ABC Television's This Week and spent over 3 decades providing regular commentary. Then followed 3 years with Fox News, where he appeared regularly on Special Report and Fox News Sunday. And he's now a regular contributor to MSNBC and NBC News. Born in Champaign, Illinois, Mr. Will was educated at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, Oxford University, and Princeton University, where he earned his PhD and also served as a trustee. Mr. Will was awarded the Madison Medal from Princeton in 1992, and today he lives and works in the Washington, D.C. area. And as Rob mentioned, he will be speaking with me for about an hour, and then he'll answer questions from all of you for about 20 to 30 minutes. So as Rob mentioned, please remember to click on the Q&A tab and type your questions in the box, and we promise to get to as many as we can. So George, you have been a lifelong conservative, And you made a very powerful statement when, in June 2016, you revealed that you had left the Republican Party, citing your disapproval of President Trump. You were then vocal in your support for Joe Biden, writing that Joe Biden's election will end National Nightmare 2.0, the nation's second domestic debacle in 2 generations. So let's kick off our discussion big. Joe Biden is now president-elect. Is the national nightmare over?
uh, we're slowly awakening. The president would help if he would uh, do something he's not fond of doing, which is have good manners and concede and facilitate the transition. But yes, I think what the American people voted, what they said basically was, we don't want a revolution, we want restoration of something like normality in Washington. They're not angry. I think some are angry, of course. The cable television contingent of the American audience is angry. But remember, there are 330 million people in our country, and at any given moment, about 325 million of them are not watching cable television and not listening to talk radio. Americans are not angry, they're exhausted. And they're exhausted because the modern presidency, no matter who occupies it, is ubiquitous and in our living rooms and almost in our face. And this particular president, that was his style. It was the source of his appeal to a great many people, to be combative and pugnacious. And the idea that that's coming to an end is the first great achievement of the election, and very nearly the thing that the election was most significant in trying to bring about.
So let's talk a bit about the election itself. Astonishingly, despite the coronavirus pandemic that has kept all of us quarantined and isolated, as well as what you've called active complicity of measures taken to minimize the number of votes cast or counted, there was a record number of votes in this election. We hit a voting percentage of approximately 67% of people in the United States, and during a pandemic, coming close to President McKinley's election in 1900, when 73% of the population voted. So this was an astounding amount of votes during a pandemic. To what do you attribute the record high turnout?
Anger on both sides of some sort, but again, the feeling that the stakes were high, that we were losing something in the United States by the nature of politics over the last 4 years. Now, political scientists have argued over the years as to whether a high voter turnout is a sign of national health, and we're always told that the more people vote, the better. I'm not sure that's the case. If you want really high voter turnout, go to Weimar Germany in 1929, 30, 31, and 32. The stakes were unhealthily high of politics in Germany. They were going to decide who controlled the violent streets and who went to concentration camps. Normally in the United States, the stakes are not that high. The basic elements of our happiness are not put at risk because we have a written constitution and stable institutions. I think high voter turnout indicates that people were more aroused than usual. They didn't vote because they were content. They voted because they were unhappy or exhausted, as I say. I think we oughtn't to celebrate too much the fact that we had this high turnout.
Okay, and you also noted in your column on October 21st that it's not yet probable, but is not highly improbable that Joe Biden can become the first candidate in 32 years to capture more than 400 electoral votes. George H.W. Bush captured 426 in 1988. And while he didn't quite get to 400 electoral votes, why do you think Biden was able to regain the blue wall in the election?
Well, the blue wall was blue for 8 consecutive elections. These were the 18 states that voted in 8 consecutive elections for the Democrats. So it was a durable wall before three bricks, particular bricks, were removed from it in 2016, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And they were removed by a cumulative total of fewer than 78,000 votes. So it wasn't Herculean to reestablish the Democratic presence there. And in fact, Joe Biden did it, but not comfortably in any of those states. So it seems to me that, give you just one statistic about the stability of our partisan divides. In the 5 elections in this century, 37 states have voted, going into this election, had voted in for the same party in presidential elections, the 5 of this century. Only one state changed of those 37 this time, and it was Arizona. Now, that's a very significant one, but it indicates a certain solidity and stolidity in American politics. I'll give you just one example. For all the turmoil in American life, there has been a kind of stability in the presidency. We had 3 consecutive 2-term presidents in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th presidents, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. The next time we had 3 consecutive 2-term presidents was Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. If President Trump had been reelected, as he well might have done but for the pandemic, if he'd been reelected, that would have been the first time in American history we would have had 4 consecutive 2-term presidents. So the nation is evenly divided. And as reflected in presidential politics, it has a kind of stability in spite of all the turmoil.
So given your comments when you became vocal in support of Biden, were you somewhat astonished at the fact that President Trump was able to pick up 73 million votes?
I was. In 2016, we had a very peculiar election. We had never before had an election in which a major party candidate, other than Barry Goldwater, for whom I cast my first presidential vote in 1964, that was the only time we had ever had a president in the history of modern polling who went into the election with higher unfavorable than favorable opinions. In 2016, we had 2 of them. And the American people said, well, we don't like Hillary Clinton, we don't like Trump, but we'll take the devil we're not less familiar with. And they voted for him. It was much more significant and much more sobering that after 4 years of this experience, he radically, substantially increased his voter turnout. Now, Joe Biden was, of course, piling up an even more impressive number, but it's a sobering thought for some of us that after 4 years of this, a large number of Americans said we want 4 more years.
And at the same time, another sobering thought that I'm curious about your thoughts is that we have to acknowledge that Democrats did not do well down ballot. They struggled with a reduced share of the vote in Black and Hispanic communities. What happened? What accounts for that?
The country remains very moderate. It's not too much to say that the country remains slightly center-right. While they were voting in California, just take California, for example, 1 in 8 Americans lives there. It's essentially a one-party state. It's indigo blue. But and 2 of their propositions this year, Proposition 15 was to change the restriction, the constitutional restriction on taxation to increase taxes on businesses and commercial property. It went down to defeat at the hands of the voters in this liberal state. Proposition 16 was to remove from the state constitution the ban on racial preferences in public education, hiring, and contracting. It too went down to defeat, although it outspent the other side by about 17-1. In Colorado, while going handily for Joe Biden, they also voted to restrict tax increases. So the country remains fairly temperate. Remember this, and Joe Biden confronting this array of candidates in the primary competition. Only a third of the Democrats in the primaries voted for Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, the two most outspoken progressives in the race. That means 66% of the Democratic primary voters voted for someone else. Joe Biden actually defeated the progressive left of the Democratic Party more easily in 2020 than Hillary Clinton defeated Bernie Sanders in 2016. So the country, there's a sense in which this nomination and almost the election was settled. February 29th, when South Carolina gave Joe Biden his first great victory and propelled him through the primary process. The country is, as I say, did not vote for revolution. It did not vote for changing the American system, for fundamentally rearranging American economic and political institutions. It did not vote to pack the Supreme Court, did not vote to abolish the Electoral College, did not vote for lots of things that the progressives wish it had voted for.
So what we do see from the results of the election with 78 million votes for Biden and 73 million for President Trump is really a nation profoundly divided, with a great divide across this country. You wrote in a recent column that the American project is more battered than at any time in 160 years. And you talked about a public evenly divided by mutual incomprehension. So what do these numbers tell us about the way each side is looking at each other? It certainly bears on what you're saying, that we're really looking at a centrist country.
An enormous number of Americans cast negative votes this year. That is, they said, we're voting against the Democrats or we're voting against the Republicans. Polls indicate an alarming development in America that for the first time ever, a great many Americans say if they're Democrats, we would not want our son or daughter to marry a Republican, and vice versa, Republicans saying the same thing. This is a kind of personalization of politics, the permeation of life by politics that is inherently unhealthy. And you know, it's not as though we're divided by the great issues that have racked this country before, such as Jim Crow or slavery, an expansion of slavery into the territories. There's no central issue like that. One of the remarkable things about the election this year is one of the issues that had been at a rolling boil through some earlier elections, immigration didn't figure at all. In fact, it's hard when you, now as the dust settles, to look back and say, what was the election about? I think the election was about manner, style, a kind of pugnacity. Joe Biden, using the pandemic in a way as an excuse to campaign virtually and not often, Joe Biden said, this is indeed a referendum. This is what I think he meant by for the soul of the country, is whether or not we're going to behave this way. And I think a lot of Americans said no. Now, that said, one of the reasons the polls were off was that generally when an incumbent is on the ballot and the election is a referendum on the incumbent, late deciders decide against the incumbent. They're late deciders because they were ambivalent, and then they say, well, let's try something new. This time, the late deciders broke in favor of the incumbent. And it will take the psephologists some while to unpack from their data and the exit polls and all the rest why that happened.
Your comment about the personalization of politics really resonates with me, and it's profound even in people's approach to the pandemic, where something that should seemingly be so simple as wearing a mask has now become politicized. And when General David Petraeus was leading the troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had corresponded, and he had shared with me early on that a primary goal of his was restoring the fabric of Iraqi society. With all the polarization that's now rampant throughout our country, I almost feel that we have to rebuild American society as well, which is rather astonishing, but there's such a vast divide. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, Donald Trump has demonstrated how the modern presidency, with its uh, domination of the political argument, armed with all the methods of modern communication, the first great one of which was radio, which Franklin Roosevelt used so well, television, which Jack Kennedy used so well. Now we have radio, television, the internet, and social media, Twitter, and all the rest. Donald Trump demonstrated in 4 years how much a president can be a tone setter for the whole society, for better or for worse. The good news about that is that it is then possible, I think, for a more calm and soothing president, if you will, to have a similar rapid and profound effect in turning down the thermostat of our politics.
So the day after the election on November 4th, you wrote a column headlined, "America is battered, but a somewhat happy ending is in sight." What is the happy ending you foresee? Is it what you just described about toning down the heat, or is what you aspire to dampened by a sense of realism of the divide across our country?
I think the happy ending is a sense that we've burned all the fuel that kept our fires going, that we're a burned over country, and now we're going to relax and deep breath and look around and say, maybe we got just a little more excited than our politics merits. Again, when my children were very young, and they would ask me if they could do something, and I would say, the answer would be yes. I'd say, yes, it's a free country, Mondale lost. Now, I was making a joke, no doubt droll and way over their heads, but I was making the point that if Mondale won, we're still a free country. That again, we don't put the basic elements of American happiness at issue in elections. The stakes of our elections are inherently confined by a constitution that protects the basic strengths and liberties of American life. So I think the happy ending is when people say life goes on and we don't have to have our teeth clenched and our fists clenched. Relax. America is still a great prosperous country that people are fighting to get into, not to get out of.
Well, that is something very important to aspire to, particularly during the pandemic. And I know that one thing that is on a lot of people's minds right now is the Georgia runoff. What do you think is the likelihood of both Democrats winning in January?
I'd be surprised if both won, but I've been surprised a lot this year, as we all have. Georgia is a very interesting state. It hadn't gone for a Republican in a very long time. For a Democrat in a very long time, since I believe Clinton in 1992. But it tells you much about American politics, the role of the suburbs. Half the people of Georgia live in the metropolitan area of Atlanta, half of them. And it was in the suburbs particularly, and particularly among suburban women, that Donald Trump was at his weakest. This is true also in Texas. The Republicans found once again that they came up short of their desire to flip Texas, but the day is coming. Texas, we think of as wide open spaces and longhorn cattle. Texas has 5 of the nation's 20 largest cities. It has 7 of the 20 fastest growing cities. Enormous suburban population. Or take Arizona, the one state of the 37 that had voted for the same party in presidential elections in the first 5 elections of this century. Arizona is a hugely suburbanized state. Let me give you some numbers here. This is just in the Phoenix area. Mesa, the suburb of Phoenix, is larger than St. Louis. Tempe is larger than Providence, Rhode Island. Scottsdale is larger than Richmond, Virginia, and Birmingham, Alabama. Glendale, Arizona is larger than Des Moines and Salt Lake City. This is a suburban nation in which the suburbs are, for the moment, very resistant to Republicans, at least Republicans of the style of Mr. Trump. The drama of Mr. Trump is this. In 2016, 87% of his vote was white. In the off-year elections of 2018, 86% of the Republican candidates' votes were white. The Republican strategy has been, under Donald Trump, to squeeze our ever larger slice of an ever smaller portion of the American electorate. Rural, small town, non-college educated, evangelical Christian. This is, as I say, a steadily shrinking part of the country. And after his very narrow victory in 2016, the president did almost nothing to enlarge his base, other than to increase the turnout among this small portion of it. Give you another interesting statistic. In 1993, Florida became the first state in which deaths among whites outnumbered births among whites. That's now true in 26 states. Georgia and Florida, the most important swing state, if it still is a swing state, and Georgia, which may now become a very important swing state. In those two states, a majority of residents under 40 are non-white. So as the country becomes more diverse, the Republicans have a challenge. Now, to be fair, Mr. Trump increased his share dramatically among Latino voters. He increased his share among African-American men. So a rather complacent Democratic view, which was that demography is destiny and demography is moving in their direction, now has to be re-examined. Because as David Winston, a very wise Republican consultant and poll taker, said just today, Joe Biden won the presidency and the Democrats lost the election, because the Democrats were supposed to have a blue wave that was going to wash across the country, and it did not happen. The American people showed a kind of discernment. The American people very often produce divided government, and it makes you think they kind of like it. Now, what you're going to see, you begin your question, to circle back to it, was about Georgia. The Republican argument in Georgia is going to be, this is a temperate country. A lot of people around Joe Biden and in the Democratic caucuses of Pelosi and Congresswoman Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer are not temperate, and therefore you need to have a check on unified government. I think that's apt to work. The question for the Republicans is, however, can they energize the Trump voters, who, as I say, are about half the voters of Georgia, with Mr. Trump not on the ticket? And they have to decide, particularly, what they want Mr. Trump to do between now and January 5th, and what he's going to do, whether they want it or not, between now and January 5th.
Your comment about Biden winning but the Democrats losing is a very interesting one. You had written at one point shortly before the election that there was going to be perhaps a fumigation election and that Trump would get the repudiation he deserved. But with Democrats gaining so many votes down ballot, clearly there's a problem on behalf of the Democrats, which leans back towards what you were saying about our having really a right centrist country. So let's move forward a little and talk about what's happening in the transition, and then we'll pivot to your outlook going forward. You had referred to the post-election messiness and written the day after Election Day that Donald Trump's rhetoric was calculated with feral cunning to preemptively delegitimize the election. And in fact, not surprisingly to pretty much everyone, legal challenges became alleges of rigged elections, etc. What do you think is going to happen regarding Trump's allegation, the legal challenges? Is this like a William Faulkner quote, a tale of sound and fury signifying nothing? Is there any likelihood of success?
No, zero. But remember that Mr. Trump's attempt to delegitimize the election did not begin the day after the election. It began in the weeks before that, when he said, knowing that there would be a large outpouring of, uh, of absentee and mail voting and early voting, and knowing that it would be largely disproportionately Democrats, and trying to encourage it to be disproportionately Democrats because he wanted to happen what in fact happened, which was as the votes were cast on election night, he looked strong, looked fairly strong, and slowly the red tide began to ebb, and the blue tide began to come in. And he had preemptively conditioned people saying, when you see this happen, it will be something sinister, something rigged. So he planned this. Now, he's not a great planner. He's an impulsive and improviser, but someone in his entourage got him to cooperate in setting this up to give resonance immediately after the election to the idea that the election had been rigged. I don't think the American people are buying it. I think he's going to look increasingly like a sore loser. This is a man whose constant desire has been to look strong, and he's going to look weak, I think. But the important thing to notice is that he's not getting anywhere in the courts. People said, and I don't know what they were thinking, they said, well, gosh, now that there's a 6-3 conservative edge in the Supreme Court, that will matter. You don't go to the Supreme Court and say, throw a switch, please, and examine the election results. You have to have a case in controversy to get to the Supreme Court, and he doesn't have one.
And you very much presaged this current state of affairs in your column that was headlined, Trump will end his presidency as he began it, whining. And you referred to him as a practitioner of crybaby conservatism. So we've had a number of post-election vengeance firings, including Defense Secretary Mark Esper, top Pentagon leaders, and most recently, Homeland Security Cyber Chief Christopher Krebs, who refuted President Trump's claims that the election was rigged. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, as I said, he would end the presidency as he began at whining. He devoted his first day, cloaked in the majesty of the presidency, complaining about a photograph. The photograph taken from the top of the Washington Monument, showing that his crowd was considerably smaller than Barack Obama's crowd in 2012. Now, a little known fact that I'm about to make known is that photograph was taken by my son-in-law, the husband of Victoria Louise Will of the great class of whatever it was, 2003 or 4. And I'm glad Mr. Trump didn't know that because it would feed his conspiracy theories. But when I say crybaby conservatism, conservatism has become under Trump about grievances, about Hollywood is picking on us, academia is picking on me, the cancel culture. And by the way, these are real complaints. I'm not saying that, but for conservatism to define itself by its victimizations, this cult of being put upon, is unworthy of a robust political persuasion with an honorable, long, and distinguished pedigree.
And you've spoken this evening about that we're talking about good manners and the restoration of good manners. So the protocol since George Washington has been to cede the stage if someone else is elected and encourage your supporters to move forward. because we're all Americans. So President Trump is clearly not approaching President-elect Biden in anything like the spirit of cooperation and goodwill that has generally characterized presidential departures in the modern era. For example, outgoing President George H.W. Bush left a letter in the Oval Office for incoming President Bill Clinton, who had just defeated him, that said in part, "I wish you well. Your success is our country's success. I am rooting hard for you." So how will the refusal of President Trump and the General Services Administration to certify Joe Biden as the winner and to be cooperative in the course of the transition prevent the Biden team from accessing government resources, intelligence briefings that impact the fight against COVID-19 and national security?
I think that that resistance will end fairly soon. It will end, as I say, when all 50 states and the District of Columbia certified their vote and when the Electoral College votes have been cast. Now, George Washington, after his successor, John Adams, gave his speech, and they were leaving the venue, and George Washington stood aside, a man of enormous presence and standing in America, stood aside so that he would follow out John Adams. Great sign of respect. Now, fast forward 4 years later, John Adams refuses to go to Jefferson's inauguration. Adams was a truculent and sometimes dyspeptic man, and quite unhappy about the bitterness of the election of 1800. And he left Washington at 4 a.m. on inauguration day and skipped the inauguration. That may happen this time. And in a way, that would be a fitting coda to this particular sour presidency. Do we really want Donald Trump on the podium on the grandstand there on the west face of the Capitol, pretending for the first time to be civil? I don't think we should obsess with Donald Trump. I think he's occupied far too much space in the national brain for far too long. We should get over this. The machinery of transition, the constitutional calendar is at work. The liturgy of the inauguration is underway and will be conducted with, I'm confident, great dignity and stirring majesty on the 20th at noon on January. And at that point, we can quit talking about him.
Okay, so let's start discussing moving our nation forward. In his victory speech, Biden pleaded for unity and healing after a vitriolic election that deeply divided the country. Do you think President Biden will be able to bridge the divide that currently confronts our country? Are we headed for a gridlock, divided government? President Obama had wanted to lead with bipartisanship, but he had difficulty meeting that goal. What do you think is going to happen in January?
I think a basis for some cheerfulness is this. Joe Biden and the most important Republican in the country, Mitch McConnell, are both men of the Senate. Joe Biden was there for 36 years. Mitch McConnell has just completed his 36th year. So 72 years of Senate experience in these two men. They are both institutionalists. They both revere the institution. And I think you're going to see, in fact, I know you're going to see, Mitch McConnell is going to say, we're going to do our part by, he's going to urge his Senate caucus not to dispute, as by the way, Democrats under Mr. Schumer have been disputing many of the nominees sent up for lesser offices by the Trump administration. Let's not have a war over the assistant secretaries of the Interior Department. It's not necessary. So I think that legislative bargaining is what legislators do. And you have two veterans of this. When President Obama needed deals struck, he sent Obama to McConnell, and they got the job done. So I think you're going to see some of this.
And are you at all concerned? I know we spoke about this before, and I think the audience would like to hear your thoughts, that McConnell and along with other Republican leaders had seemingly backed Trump in terms of his allegations of election fraud, et cetera?
I think that you have to parse their language as carefully as I know they're parsing it. Mitch McConnell, for one, has said only this. He said Donald Trump has a right to contest elections where he thinks there is grounds for contesting them, period. That's all he said. And that's a pretty anodyne statement. I can tell you that with the possible exception of Lindsey Graham, who is a case study in Trump derangement in a way, with the possible exception of Lindsey Graham, I don't think there's an iota of affection in the Republican Senate caucus for Donald Trump. These are people who I think feel somewhat humiliated and embarrassed by the fact that they are so terrified of their own constituents, so terrified of the large Trump component of their electoral base that they have been walking on eggshells for 4 years, afraid to provoke a Twitter storm. They saw what happened to Senator Flake of Arizona and others who got crosswise with the president, and they didn't want that. They are heaving a collective sigh of relief now, and I think are ready for a less combative politics. Some, however, are going to look at these election results and say, the Trump message still resonates, we just need a better messenger. And the Senate caucus is never absent presidential aspirants. So the Marco Rubios and Ted Cruz and Tom Cotton and Ben Sasse and lots of others will be deciding how to approach the Republican nominating electorate of 2024. Now, those are very different people. Ben Sasse has been somewhat critical of Mr. Trump. Ben Sasse is a Yale history PhD and a quite sophisticated and learned fellow, more than some of his colleagues. So we shall see. But so Mitch McConnell's task will be complicated somewhat by managing a caucus full of would-be presidents. But again, it's way too soon to despair.
Isn't it a very frightening concept that all these political leaders from the Republican Party could be scared into acquiescence because of the prospect of Trump bullying them via Twitter and everything? It's interesting. Columnist and author Thomas Friedman has written about Trump. This is not a political party, it's a cult. So what do you envision as the impact of President Trump on our country and on the Republican Party? And how do you feel about the fear that he engendered among other Republicans that prevented them from possibly voicing their honest sentiments for fear of retaliation?
Well, the obedience to Trump, the walking on eggshells that I described, was simple fear of people who don't want to lose their jobs. Now, I have a solution for that, and it's called term limits. And I feel strongly enough about term limits that I wrote a book on it, read by dozens. It had no effect. But I do believe that if we had term limits, that if a senator could only serve 2 terms, or a member of the House 6 2-year terms, and 12 years for each body, you would have very different behavior, that people would think of the next generation more than the next election. That's not going to happen because the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision in 1995, with the swing vote being, as you would expect, Justice Kennedy, said, and I think they were actually right about this, that term limit, that term limits is adding to the Constitution a qualification for office, that it therefore can only be accomplished, term limits can, by a constitutional amendment. And it's not going to happen that Congress is going to send to the states for ratification a constitutional amendment that limits the members' careers. They're just not going to do it. So we're stuck with that. But I do believe that you're going to see a more wholesome politics, because I think Republicans are more than faintly embarrassed by the servile nature of their behavior in the last few years. Teddy Roosevelt once said of an opponent that he could have carved more backbone out of a chocolate eclair. He said he had a backbone fixation. He said of Oliver Wendell Holmes that he could find a justice with more he could have carved a backbone out of a banana. And I think, although we don't talk that way right now, I think Republicans in the Senate particularly have been embarrassed by the fact that they stopped being a deliberative body and became team members of the executive branch, which is not what James Madison, the great class of 1771, had in mind when he constructed the constitutional equilibrium of our three branches of government. He wanted the Senate to feel not as a collaborator of the president, but as a principled adversary with its own dignity and its own responsibilities and its own independent role to play. And I think if we can get back to something like the Madisonian vision of equilibrium, of robust branches of government, a wholesome rivalry, then I think we will accomplish what most needs to be done, which is to shrink the modern presidency back to something like human dimensions, so that our entire national psyche isn't wound up in presidential elections and in presidential comportment between the elections.
So I must say, I will never look at a chocolate eclair again, I think. Right. It's a very interesting concept. There are so many issues confronting our country right now, ranging from COVID-19 to our financial situation, unemployment, climate change, the need for racial and economic opportunity. Once President-elect Biden is in office, what are the key issues that you believe will be his priorities, and how has he started to lay the groundwork?
I think the one issue that is out there is going to be debt. 10 years ago, the public held national debt was 53% the size of the economy, of the GDP. Now it's over 100% the size of GDP. Economists have argued about at what level of debt relative to GDP does the debt begin to have a suffocating effect on the economy. We don't know where it is, but we're going to find out, because we're going to have yet another multi-trillion-dollar stimulus package, I'm pretty sure, coming down the way. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong to do that. We're in desperate times, desperate measures and all that. But there are two ways to finance a government: current taxes and future taxes. And debt is taxation deferred. So when you have taxation at this debt at this level, you become a hostage to interest rates. Right now, the assumption is, and it's been holding true for a while, is that we are in an era of permanent low interest rates, that the world is awash in savings. And therefore, this is called modern monetary theory. Therefore, when you can print your own currency, and particularly when you're the world's reserve currency, you can essentially spend as much as you want, prudently piling up debt that in other circumstances would not be prudent. Now, modern monetary theory is what the Democrats praise and embrace, and the Republicans criticize and practice from the Elizabeth Warren on the left to Ted Cruz on the right. I am more disturbed by a consensus than I am by discord. And the consensus, left, right, and center among the entire political class is that we should have a large, generous, omnipresent, omniprovident entitlement state and not pay for it. Everyone's agreed on that. Someone proposes a program and say, well, how's he going to pay for it? We don't pay for it. The political class has discovered the delight of giving the American people $1 worth of government and charging them 75 cents for it. The political class likes it, the public likes it, everyone likes it, because we're going to fob off on future generations part of the cost of our own current consumption of government goods and services. We used to borrow money for the future. We fought wars for the future. We built roads, airports, dams, highways for the future. Now we're borrowing from the future for our current consumption of goods and services, not for infrastructure and improvements and all the rest. This is one of the things that's going to eventually come home to roost with the Biden administration. Second thing that's going to happen is states are going to turn to Congress for aid. A number of them states that have, regardless of the pandemic and regardless of its cost on the economy, we're heading for deep trouble. Illinois is the biggest example. And there will be a severe resistance to that on the part of Republicans, particularly in the Senate. The big issue in the campaign, to the extent, again, that there was an issue, is healthcare. Can I give you just a few statistics about healthcare? In 1900, medicine was so primitive that if we'd had national income statistics, which we didn't, it would have been too small to show up as part of the American economy. In 1900, the American people spent twice as much money on funerals as they did on healthcare. Most Americans were born at home, died at home, and the most that medicine could do is when they got sick, it could make them comfortable while nature healed them or killed them. In 1900, 32% of all deaths were from infectious diseases. Pre-pandemic, it was only 2% in the United States. In 1900, only 17% of all deaths were Americans over 65. Today, it's 75% of deaths are of Americans over 65. Longevity is a wonderful social achievement, but it's very expensive because for Americans 85 and older, and that, by the way, is the most rapidly growing age cohort in the country. For an 85-year-old American, the average healthcare costs are 5 times higher than for a 55-year-old. So we have an aging population attached as a matter of entitlement through government programs to our extraordinarily dynamic science of medicine. It's very expensive, and we're still figuring out how to pay for it.
Thank you. That concept of borrowing against our children's futures is certainly a very sobering one. Thinking a bit out of the box before we head to our audience questions, at the beginning of our republic, the loser in a presidential race became vice president. So when John Adams ran against George Washington, the loser was vice president. In 2008, Unity 08 was an American political reform movement that sought to offer a bipartisan alternative with a Republican as president and a Democrat as vice president, or vice versa. Should we force collaboration, progress, and bipartisanship through a new system?
No, that would be a calamity. The fact is, political parties are useful. They organize our political arguments and they give our politics weight. Since the Republican Party was founded in 1854 and ran its first presidential candidate in 1856, these two parties have framed our political competition ever since. And by and large, it's not bad the way they've done it. So I think we ought to understand that people differ, we divide, we cluster, we call those clusters parties, and we fight it out. And the winner wins and the loyal opposition loyally opposes. I wouldn't try to to scramble things by compelling statutorily uh, a mixing of the parties.
Okay, and now looking at our questions, going to the audience, and I have to say, this is really incredible. We've got over 100 questions from the audience, and we had over 1,200 people sign up for tonight's event due to the interest in the topic, but mostly, I'm sure, due to our eminent columnist. And George, it's really tremendous to hear your insights and your perspective. So some of the questions people have been asking tie into what we were just discussing, the party system. And questions are, do you see the formation of a third, more centrist party, as both Republicans and Democrats seem to be moving to the extremes? Or is there a chance of fragmenting to a four-party system with far right and far left fragments of the current parties? And will the GOP in the future more closely resemble a Trump party or a more traditional Republican party?
Well, there's lots to unpack in that, multiple questions. First, the Democratic Party is not going to extremes. The Democratic Party it did well in the 2018 off-year elections because it nominated centrists who won. After this election, Abigail Spanberger, a freshman seeking her second term in the House from Virginia, a centrist Democrat, former CIA employee, almost lost. She won with only 50.4% of the vote. And in a vigorous, by which I mean profanity-laced telephone call with some other members of the Democratic House caucus, she said she almost lost because of a negative ad associating her with defunding the police. That's arguably the most destructive political slogan in modern times. Almost cost, well, it did cost the Democrats the blue wave. It cost them at least 9, maybe as many as 14 seats in the House before this is all over. So I don't think the Democratic Party is moving to the extreme. The Republican Party has a decision to make, and we'll see about that. But our political parties are exquisitely sensitive market mechanisms. Or to change the metaphor, they're like the seismographs registering with a minute Richter scale every tremor of public opinion. They will adjust. They really will. If the country wants centrism, and I think it does, they will go there. As for third parties and independent candidates, it's been well said that they're like wasps in America. They sting and then they die. Usually they get nowhere because of the winner-take-all allocation of electoral votes in 48 of the 50 states, all but Maine and Nebraska. That is, because of that, you can have, as you did in 1992, Ross Perot he got 19.7% of the popular vote and 0 electoral votes. George Wallace got some electoral votes in 1968 because he had the magic 3 components of a third party effort in this country: a vivid personality, a burning issue, civil rights and urban disorder, and a regional base. But basically, we are pretty much insulated against any successful third party candidate. Now, granted, the Republicans were a third party at one point. That is, they eclipsed the Whigs, which when the Whigs could not cope with the sectional arguments over slavery. So it's not inconceivable, but it's highly unlikely. We are stuck with the 2 parties that have framed our politics, as I say, since Fremont ran for the Republicans in 1856, and will continue to do so. But again, the good news is they are market sensitive, and they will go where the votes are.
Okay, we also have a number of questions about the media, which was certainly a topic that was foremost on President Trump's mind. So, and thank you to Christina Murphy for compiling these questions. To what extent do you think mainstream media is responsible for dividing the nation? It seems that most Americans feel that media and journalists are biased now. Has this changed in recent decades? Does this concern you? And can journalism return to a more objective position?
Well, first, understand, as journalists are loath to do, that journalists aren't nearly as important as they think they are. And they're the ones driving this current discussion about journalism. In the introduction to me tonight, it quoted the Wall Street Journal saying that I might be the most important journalist in America. That's like being called the tallest building in Topeka. Journalists are not that important, period. The American, the strange osmosis by which a continental nation makes up its mind is a mystery to me. I've been doing this for 47 years now, and I still don't know what makes the American mind get made up. But they don't listen to the media, tug their forelocks, and do as they're told. The American people are much more complicated than that. It is the case that Donald Trump became an excuse for journalists to abandon even the pretense of objectivity in many cases. We know from abundant surveys that 97% of journalists are liberal Democrats. Got that. But that's not moving the country. Bigger, deeper forces are moving the country. Remember this also. In the 1790s, when political parties, which the framers neither anticipated nor desired, suddenly emerged, the newspapers, and we were a ravenous reading nation, ravenous for newspapers. The newspapers were often not just formally, not just ideologically allied with the two parties, they were often formally subsidized by them. Whoever controlled the State Department would, as Jefferson did, Jefferson used printing contracts from the State Department to subsidize his favorite newspapers, and the Federalists did the same thing. Which is to say, the ideal of objective journalism is fairly recent, and we may have gone back to an old tradition of, frankly, partisan journalism. I think that's unfortunate if true. It's certainly the case in the cable news universe. It is increasingly the case with the New York Times, which decided to become quite partisan with the 1619 Project and all the rest. But you used a phrase that I think we ought to reconsider, and that's the mainstream media. We may think the mainstream media is CBS, NBC, ABC, and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. That's not where a lot of people are getting their news. They're getting it from Facebook and YouTube and all the rest. The mainstream media runs the danger of being considered irrelevant. I don't know anyone under 30 who reads a hard copy of a newspaper, and I'm not sure how many I know under 30 who read newspapers. They read other stuff to get their news. So the mainstream media may find that it is not the mainstream, but it's a dwindling creek.
Another question that we had pertains to what Rob Wolk mentioned, that both the Princeton Alumni Association of New York City as well as the Princeton Club had interviewed Andrew Weissman about his book, Where Law Ends, and the Inside the Mueller investigation. And I believe many people felt that the Mueller investigation really passed on the role of holding President Trump accountable for obstruction of justice to either Congress or to the courts. So a number of people asked, once President Trump leaves office on January 20th, Do you think that the president and his family members will be prosecuted for bank fraud, tax fraud, and obstruction of justice, among other potential crimes?
First, let me say that it was not the mission of the Miller investigation to hold the president accountable. The function of Mr. Mueller's investigation was to find out what happened, to find out the extent of the foreign interference in the 2016 election. This much we can say for sure. The election, the interference by the Russians in the 2016 election was far less important to that election than the decision by the Hillary Clinton campaign not to campaign in Wisconsin, which is to say, there was interference. The intelligence community is united on that. It should be resisted, but there's really no evidence that the American people are manipulated by the kind of foolishness that gets just inserted into social media by malefactors from adversarial nations. With regard to Mr. Trump's potential problems, economic and otherwise, I have no idea what they are. I'm not a lawyer, although I play one on television. I strongly suspect that Mr. Biden has zero interest in seeing the 45th president turned into a martyr in the eyes of his still fervid supporters. I have no idea what's in the mind of Mr. Vance in New York with his grand juries and his investigations, but I would hope not. I would hope that whatever it is might keep Mr. Trump so busy and distracted that he will be able to ignore Republican politics, but that's perhaps a utopian dream.
Another question, which is a very important one as we look forward, is what moves do you think that Biden can make to unify the nation over the next 4 years?
Well, Biden's in a good position because he did something Hillary Clinton didn't do. Hillary Clinton lost the popular vote outside of California. Think about that. In 49 states in the District of Columbia, if you pool those votes, she lost the popular vote. She won the popular vote only because she carried California by 4.5 million votes. Joe Biden carried the popular vote outside California, so he does have, in a sense, a kind of mandate. Now, his mandate is in part to not be Donald Trump. His mandate is in part to be a balm on a harried country. But he's good at that. He's not a flamboyant man, and he's not an angry man. So I think that when the dust settles and people look at the final tabulation of votes, I think people are going to do what the Americans in their good nature generally do, which is give the president a honeymoon, and we'll get back to normal political sparring, which is going to be so much more temperate than things have been recently. That my favorite candidate for the Democrats this year was Senator Bennett of Colorado. He didn't go anywhere, but he deserved to, because he said, if you elect me president, you can go weeks at a time without ever thinking about me. That's the kind of president I want, and I think the country would love to have.
Well, speaking about the president who's moving out of office, what do you think his end game is? He certainly was very upset that Fox News called it for Arizona, and some have speculated that he's going to start his own new media company. Others have said he'll probably throw his hat in the ring again in 2024. What are your thoughts?
My thought is that I'm going to take a Trappist vow of silence about Donald Trump. He'll be what, 78 then, 77 in 2024. there are lots of ambitious young Republicans who would like him to go away so they can have their own run. I think that I strongly doubt that there's going to be a huge pent-up demand for more Trump in 4 years from now.
Okay, and I want to say a lot of people in the Q&A are asking questions about the Electoral College. So we'd love your thoughts about that. And I want to thank everybody for your active participation and sending in questions. It's a reflection of everything that George is saying and the interest in his perspective and insights. And we really appreciate your sharing your questions with us. So what are your thoughts about the Electoral College? Is it here to stay, pros and cons? We've certainly seen some of the weaknesses in it when presidents are elected despite not having the popular vote.
That's not a terrible weakness, I don't think. For example, in 2000, when Al Gore lost the electoral vote but won the popular vote by 500,000 out of umpty-ump millions cast. There was a tie, so there was no great injustice there. My view on the Electoral College is A, it's here to stay, and B, I'm very glad for that. Why is it here to stay? One of the reasons people want to get rid of it is by giving 2 senators from Wyoming and 2 senators from California, which California has 39 million residents, Wyoming has 600,000, that it gives extra weight of not a lot, but some extra weight to the smaller states. You can't get rid of the Electoral College without amending the Constitution. You can't amend the Constitution if 13 states oppose an amendment, and 13 of the smaller states will oppose abolishing the Electoral College, and therefore it's not going to be abolished. Now, why am I glad? Go back to 2000. We had a problem in Florida, but with vote tabulations and all the rest, but at least it was quarantined to Florida. Imagine if you poured the entire popular vote of the United States into one enormous bucket and had a very close election. You would then have litigation in every precinct across this country. Furthermore, the Electoral College encourages broad campaigning, encourages it to go to South Dakota. Donald Trump went to Nebraska, as I believe Joe Biden did, because one district there with one electoral vote, Nebraska does this by congressional district, was worth competing for. Otherwise, candidates would be content to go to the large cities and run up their popular vote and ignore much of the country. I think the Electoral College encourages coalition building. It encourages a broad agenda. It encourages paying attention to parts of the country that otherwise would be, in the rather dismissive phrase used nowadays, flyover country. I think the Electoral College is the world's most successful mechanism for electing an executive, proven over nearly now 2.5 centuries.
Okay, one person has asked us, how have your views changed over the last 2 decades?
Well, I didn't used to be for term limits. Now I am, but I didn't used to be for a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. I am now, partly because I think the political class is incorrigible on this. And I think some very intelligent men and women have devised a suitable constitutional amendment. I discuss it in my most recent book, The Conservative Sensibility. I think my biggest change is that I used to be worried about judicial activism. I wanted more judicial passivity and more judicial deference to the legislative branches and to the state legislatures. I've now changed completely. I'm in favor of what's called judicial engagement. I think the United States is not about majority rule. It is about liberty, and the majority rule can often threaten liberty. And I think I want the judiciary to be active in supervising democracy, in fending off threats to majority posed by unwise and potentially abusive majorities. Let me just say this. I grew up in Champaign, Illinois, Champaign County. It was in the Champaign County Courthouse, great red Indiana limestone building in Urbana Courthouse Square. It is, according to local lore, that was in the Champaign County Courthouse that a prosperous Illinois railroad lawyer named Abraham Lincoln heard that Stephen A. Douglas, the senator from Illinois, had successfully passed through the Senate the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which said we're going to solve the problem of what to do about the question of the expansion of slavery into the territories by popular sovereignty. Let the people of Kansas, Nebraska, and the other territories vote it up or vote it down as a matter of moral indifference to Stephen A. Douglas. He said, because America is about majority rule. Lincoln recoiled against this, and in his recoil began his ascent to greatness by saying America is not about majority rule, it's about liberty. It's not about a process, majority rule, it's about a condition, liberty. And steeped as I am as a native of Central Illinois and in the spirit of Lincoln, I want the judiciary to be actively engaged in policing the excesses of majoritarian institutions. That's probably the biggest change in my thinking of the last 50 years. But then my PhD at Princeton, my doctoral dissertation was called Beyond the Reach of Majorities. It's from a phrase in Justice Robert Jackson's opinion in West Virginia versus Barnett, a case in 1943, when they reversed them, so the court reversed itself, reversed a decision taken in 1939, I believe, Minersville v. Gobitis. The court said we were wrong. The state of Pennsylvania, no state can compel students against their religious beliefs to salute the flag, the second flag salute case. And Justice Jackson said the very purpose of a Bill of Rights is to put certain things beyond the reach of majorities, beyond the vicissitudes of politics. And so in a way, I'm still building on my doctoral dissertation from those many years ago.
It's nice to know that we're still learning from our Princeton days. Just carrying on from how your views have changed, I'm curious, did it require a tremendous amount of soul searching for you as a conservative to change and come out in favor of Biden?
Oh, heavens no. That's just politics, for goodness sake. It's not like leaving a family or a church. It's a political party, for goodness sake. On June 2nd, 2016, Donald Trump had clinched the nomination, was not yet the nominee. Paul Ryan, who I like and admire very much, was Speaker of the House. Intelligent, cheerful, public-spirited, policy-serious man. He endorsed Trump. And I said, well, they're going to normalize this guy, and I don't want to be part of that. So I said, I'm no longer a Republican. But that's not a trauma, for goodness sake. I go, how many normal Americans sit around thinking about their political identity? It's unhealthy if they do. They ought to get out more.
Yeah, although on the other hand, I know people on both sides of the aisle, and many of my friends who are conservatives, despite not wanting to vote for Trump, did anyway because they voted clean down the line, conservative. So,
well, I'd never voted for a Democrat before, but my best friend in Washington for many years was a Democrat, Senator Pat Moynihan of New York. We disagreed about lots of things, but I admired him tremendously and just loved his friendship. And politics isn't that important to be. I mean, God knows it's important. I've devoted my life to talking about it. But it's not that important that you have to be obsessed by it. Look, Americans are divided. If all the people watching this little event tonight were in one ballroom, I would ask for a show of hands on the following question. How many of you own or know someone who owns a Ford F-150 pickup truck? Now, people say, why is Will talking about pickup trucks? For 40 years now, the Ford F-150 pickup truck has been the best-selling vehicle, not the best-selling truck, the best-selling vehicle in the United States. And I imagine that most Ford F-150 pickup truck owners probably voted for Trump. And most of the people who voted for Biden neither own one nor know someone who owns them. Now, there's a cultural divide here in this country, but it's hardly an unbridgeable divide. I mean, this country flew apart once over the issue of whether some human beings can own other human beings. That's when the stakes of politics were really high. And it behooves us to understand that our politics is at its healthiest when the stakes are agreeably low, even boring. Donald Trump, in his knack for nicknames that he thinks insult people, referred to Sleepy Joe Biden. I hope so. I think the country's ready for a sleepy president.
On the other hand, and we've had a number of questions about this, there are a lot of really pressing issues confronting our country. So people have asked, what are your thoughts on the agenda that Biden has indicated he will pursue? Racial equity, climate change, stronger labor unions, few restrictions on immigration, etc.
Well, good luck with that. I mean, that's what he's supposed to do. That represents basic interests of his party, and he ought to have them on his agenda. But I have some bad news. It's actually good news. America in late November 2021 is going to look an awful lot like America in late November in 2020. The country does not lurch. It was not designed to lurch. When the framers of our Constitution, led by Princeton's first graduate student, James Madison, went to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, they did not go to design an efficient government. The idea would have appalled them. They wanted a safe government, one strong enough to protect our liberties, but not strong enough to threaten them. Therefore, they built a government full of blocking mechanisms, 3 branches of government, 2 branches of the legislative branch with different electoral rhythms and constituencies, veto overrides, judicial review, supermajorities, all kinds of ways of slowing things down. And that will continue to work that way, particularly because the American people have yet again produced a seemingly divided government, pending what the people of Georgia decide. What that means is not that nothing's going to happen. People say, well, we've had terrible gridlock under Barack Obama. Under Barack Obama, we had the Affordable Care Act, the largest, most significant expansion of the entitlement states since Medicare and Medicaid in 1965. We had in Dodd-Frank the most sweeping reform of financial regulation since the 1930s. Things got done. And in fact, even with the Madisonian system of checks and balances that intentionally makes movement difficult, I can think of nothing the American people have wanted intensely and protractedly that they did not get. But it will not come in lurches and it will not come in spasms. And a lot of the things that some members of Mr. Biden's parties want, that I mentioned earlier in our conversation, packing the Supreme Court, abolishing the Electoral College, et cetera, are not going to happen.
Okay, and now we come to a set of questions about one of your favorite topics. What is your prediction for the Dodgers repeating in 2021? And as a related question, with Theo Epstein leaving your beloved team, the Cubs, Are you interested and available to be the next general manager?
Yes, I'm available. I'm not qualified, but I'm available. You mentioned earlier in my book, Men at Work, The Craft of Baseball. I've published 15 books, and it is sold more than the other 14 combined, which is a very good sign of health on the part of the American people, that they're more interested in baseball than they are in term limits and the other things I've written about. It's really hard to repeat in baseball. Ask the Houston Astros, ask the Washington Nationals. But if any team is set to do it, it is the Dodgers, because they're really well run. So don't bet against the Dodgers, but don't bet your net worth on the Dodgers.
And are you thinking of changing careers and assuming the general manager position?
Well, as I say, the general managers of these teams are Ivy League hotshot analytics, statistic mavens who can do things with numbers that I can't do. So as I say, I'd love the job, but I'm not qualified.
Okay, well, I have to say thank you to everyone for those incredibly thoughtful questions and for staying on for over half an hour of questions. George, I have to say this has been an incredible discussion, and we greatly appreciate your insights, your perspective. Clearly, having 700 people stay on until the end at 8 o'clock is a testament to your wit, your intellect, and all the insightful things you have to say about our country and where it's going. And it's an honor to be able to discuss these important topics with you tonight. I want to thank the Princeton Club of New York and the Princeton Alumni Association of New York City for co-sponsoring this program, and a big thank you to my fellow co-hosts Christina Bott Murphy and Rob Wolk. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening, participated so actively in the discussion. The Princeton Club is recording this talk, and both Panic and the Princeton Club will be sharing the link with everyone, as well as links to some of the books that George mentioned. So despite the challenges of the moment, the new year will bring the inauguration of President-elect Biden and hopefully a vaccine against COVID-19. And with it, we hope our new leadership will find a way to focus on progress over politics to move our nation forward. Thank you again very much for joining us this evening, especially you, Mr. Will. Stay safe, everyone, and stay healthy.
Well, I just wanted to say how much I've enjoyed this. I want to thank those who participated in this. I hope they were doing, while we were having this conversation, what I'm about to do, which is have a martini. And I hope that the Alumni Association will find another occasion for me to do this when there'll be something other to talk about than all this stuff.
It would be our pleasure.